Good morning, everybody. We are starting today with Shrimad Bhagavata Mahapurana, Book 10, Discourse 78. Or sorry, that's slightly ahead there. Not 78, 76, which is entitled Shalva's Encounter with the Yadavas. This one takes place during the previous discourse or two, rather than after them, in a different location. So the last time we were reading, Krishna was attending the Rajasuya Yajna of Emperor Yudhishthira at Indraprastha. Sri Shuka began again. Parikshit, now hear the story of still another wonderful achievement of Bhagavan Sri Krishna, who had sportfully assumed a human semblance. This relates to the death of Shalva, owner of the celebrated aerial car called Saubha. Shalva was a friend of Shishupala and accompanied the latter for his wedding with Rukmini, back when Shishupala attempted to marry Rukmini and Shalva was in his bridegroom's party. At that time, Shalva, along with Jarasandha and others, was completely routed in battle by the Yadus. Within the hearing of all the princes assembled there, Shalva took a vow, saying, I shall rid the earth of the Yadavas. You will then witness my prowess. Parikshit, having thus pledged himself, the fool began to worship the god of gods, Shankara, taking by way of nourishment only a handful of dust once a day. At the end of a year, the almighty spouse of Uma, Lord Shankara, who is often propitiated very soon, offered to confer a boon on Shalva, who had sought his protection. Shalva requested the Lord to confer on him an aerial car, which could be taken wherever he liked, and which could not be broken by the Devas, Asuras, humans, Gandharvas, and Rakshasas, and which would be a terror to the Yadus. Shankara said, be it so. Under Shankara's command, Mayasura, who could easily bring about the fall of an enemy's stronghold, constructed an aerial car called Saubha, which was made of steel, and handed it over to Shalva. It was not a car, but a city in miniature. Full of darkness, it was inaccessible. Full of darkness within, it was inaccessible. That's a bit of an obscurely translated verse. What it means is that it contained contents, perhaps a gas or perhaps some supernatural effect, such that it could release an effect of darkness like a smoke screen around it to produce clouds and a visual blurring effect to conceal its own location in the sky. It could be taken wherever one liked. Obtaining this car, Shalva proceeded against Dwaraka, remembering the old grudge against the Yadus. Parikshit, and so this takes place, Parikshit explains this later, but just to be clear from the start, this happened while Krishna was at Indraprastha, attending Yudhishthira's Rajasuya Yajna. Shalva besieged the city of Dwaraka with a large army and engaged himself in the wholesale destruction of its gardens and parks, the gateways with their massive superstructures, the mansions with their upper chambers and compound wall, and the places of recreation. The reason he's striking the superstructures of the gateway on top and the upper chambers of the mansion and so on is because he's attacking primarily from the sky, from his flying battle station. Volleys of destructive weapons rained down from that huge aerial car. Blocks of stone, trees, thunderbolts, serpents, and hailstones were showered on the city, and a fearful tornado was let loose over it, filling the quarters with dust. Just as in days of yore, the earth suffered under the scourge of the demon Tripura, who also piloted flying cities to ravage the earth. Also built by Mayasura, who built this one. Even so, the city of Dwaraka was subjected to untold suffering by Shalva's aerial car, Saubha. The people could not find respite. Observing the distress of the people, the renowned warrior Bhagavan Pradyumna, Krishna's firstborn son, mounted his chariot and cheered them by saying, fear not. Satyaki, Charudeshna, Samba, Akrura and his younger brothers, Kritavarma, Bhanuvinda, Gada, Shuka, Sharana, or Sarana, and many other big generals followed him with mighty bows in their hands. They were all protected with armors and were guarded by chariots, elephants, horses, and foot soldiers. Just as in the days of yore there was a bitter conflict between the Devas and Asuras, even so a fierce and thrilling battle ensued between the soldiers of Shalva and the Yadavas. With the help of his celestial weapons, Pradyumna broke in an instant the magic spell of Shalva, the owner of Saubha, even as the sun dispels the darkness of the night. With 25 arrows having feathers of gold and iron tips, and with the knots of their wood well polished, he pierced the commander-in-chief of Shalva's army. With 100 more, he struck Shalva himself, and discharged 1 arrow each at his soldiers, 10 each at his charioteers, and 3 each at his horses. Seeing this great and wonderful feat of arms exhibited by the valiant Pradyumna, the soldiers on both sides admired him. The aerial car of Shalva, constructed by Maya, contained such magical contrivances that now it appeared as many, and now as only one. Now it appeared in the sky, and now disappeared altogether. The Yadavas therefore found it difficult to discover where it was at a particular moment. Now it descended on the ground, now it flew into the air, now perched on the summit of a hill, and now began to float on water. Like a rotating firebrand, it went round and round, hardly stopping at any point. Wherever Shalva with his car and soldiers came within their sight, the generals of the Yadava army showered their arrows on them. Struck by those arrows, which burned like the sun and fire and were unapproachable like venomous snakes, Shalva's floating city and army sustained a severe blow, and Shalva himself fainted. The Yadava warriors, too, were equally harassed by the volleys of arms showered by the generals of Shalva's army, but they did not abandon their respective positions on the battlefield, for they thought that death in battle would secure happiness in the other world, whereas victory would establish their supremacy on earth. There was a minister of Shalva and a mighty warrior, Dyuman by name, to whom Pradyumna had previously dealt severe blows. He now suddenly attacked Pradyumna with a steel mace, and striking a heavy blow with it, gave a loud roar. The blow smashed the chest of Pradyumna, the chastiser of foes. Thereupon Daruka's son, his charioteer, knowing the canons of warfare, carried him away from the field. Daruka, I'll remind you, is Krishna's own charioteer. So Daruka's son is the charioteer of Krishna's son, following in the family dharma. Regaining consciousness after about an hour, Pradyumna said to his charioteer, "O charioteer, you have done me a disservice by removing me from the field of battle. No one born in Yadu's race except me is known to have abandoned the battlefield. You are a weak-minded charioteer. You have certainly wronged me. What reply befitting my position shall I give to my uncle, Sri Balarama, and my father, Sri Krishna, when I see them and when they question me, now that I have cleverly managed to flee away from the battlefield? My sisters-in-law will laugh at me and openly say, 'Please do tell us, O warrior, how you lost your manliness in the encounter with your enemy.'" The charioteer replied, "O long-lived one," he chooses that particular term of address very pointedly, "I did all this knowingly, considering it to be the proper duty of a charioteer. Lord, the rule of battle is that the charioteer should come to the rescue of the warrior when the latter's life is in danger, and similarly, the warrior should save the life of the charioteer in peril. Cognizant of this rule, I removed you from the battlefield when I found that, struck by the enemy with a mace, you had sustained a fatal injury and fated. By a fatal injury, he means an injury that would have been fatal had he not been removed from the battle." Thus ends the 76th discourse, bearing on the encounter with Shalva in the latter half of Book 10 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. Discourse 77, Shalva's deliverance. Sri Shuka began again. Pradyumna now washed his hands and face, put on his armor, took up the bow, and spoke to his charioteer thus: "Take me to the warrior Dyuman." Dyuman was at that time playing havoc with the Yadava army. First checking his depredations, Pradyumna smilingly assailed Dyuman with 8 shafts. With 4 he struck his 4 horses, with 1 the charioteer, and with 1 shaft each he tore off Dyuman's bow and banner, and with the remaining 1 he struck down Dyuman's head. Gada, Satyaki, Samba, and others began to mow down the army of Shalva. The inmates of the aerial car Sobha with their necks severed from their bodies, dropped one by one into the sea. Thus the Yadava army and the army of Shalva began to strike one another, and a fierce hand-to-hand fight raged between them for 27 days and nights without break. Having been invited by Yudhishthira, Bhagavan Sri Krishna was at that time staying at Indraprastha. Now that the Rajasuya Yajna had been concluded and Shishupala had been killed, Sri Krishna took leave of the elderly Kurus and Rishis, Kunti and the Pandavas, and proceeded to Dwaraka. On his way, he observed frightful omens. He therefore said to himself, I came away hither with my revered brother Sri Balarama. The kings in alliance with Shishupala must have surely availed themselves of the opportunity to attack Dwaraka. Reaching there, he found his people in a sad plight. Entrusting Balarama with the work of defending the city, and observing Shalva and his aerial car Sobha, he said to his charioteer Daruka, Take my chariot with great dispatch to Shalva, owner of the aerial car Sobha. Take care that you do not get frightened, for he is a warrior skilled in the use of magic. Thus instructed, Daruka mounted the chariot and drove it to the battlefield. As soon as Sri Krishna entered the field of battle, warriors on both sides recognized him from the emblem of Garuda borne on his banner. Shalva's army had already mostly been extirpated. Observing Sri Krishna on the battlefield, Shalva discharged a terrible lance aimed at his charioteer. With a terrible noise, it rushed through the air with great speed like a meteor, illumining the quarters. Bhagavan Sri Krishna tore that lance into 100 pieces with his arrows, hit Shalva with 16 shafts, and pierced the aerial car, Sobha, that was wheeling in the sky, with volleys of arrows, even as the sun fills the space with his rays. In the meantime, Shalva hit Sri Krishna in the left arm with an arrow. The Sharanga bow, which was being held by that arm, fell from Sri Krishna's hand. It was a wonderful feat on the part of Shalva. A loud outcry of wonder and fear rose from beings who watched the conflict, from the sky or from the ground. Shalva now gave a loud roar and said to Sri Krishna, O deluded fool, you carried away before our very eyes the fiancé of our friend and brother Shishupala and killed him in an assembly when he was off his guard. I know you regard yourself as invincible, but if you stand before me in this fight today, I shall with my sharp arrows send you to the region from where people do not return. Bhagavan Sri Krishna replied, O fool, in vain do you brag. You do not perceive death standing before you. True heroes do not waste their words, but exhibit their prowess in battle. Saying this, Bhagavan Sri Krishna, in great rage, struck Shalva with tremendous force on the collarbone with his mace. It made Shalva shake from head to foot and vomit blood. When the mace returned to the Lord, so in other words, Krishna had thrown this mace and then pulled it supernaturally back to his hand. Shalva, for his part, suddenly disappeared. Then, after an hour, a certain person came in, bowed with his head bent low to Sri Krishna, and bursting into tears, said, I have brought a message from Devaki. She says, O Krishna of mighty arms, most devoted to parents, your father has been captured and carried away by Shalva, just as a butcher drags an animal to be slaughtered. Hearing this unpleasant news, Bhagavan Sri Krishna exhibited the play of human emotions. Troubled at heart and full of compassion and filial affection, like an ordinary human being, he said, How is it that my brother, who cannot be subdued or daunted even by devas or asuras, has been overcome by Shalva, who though a pygmy before him has succeeded in carrying away our father? Indeed, Providence is all-powerful. While Sri Krishna was saying this, Shalva made his appearance before him, holding Vasudeva, his father, as it were, and said to him, O fool, here is your father who hath brought you into being and for whom you live. I shall slay him before your eyes. Save him if you can. Uttering this threat, that master of magic, Shalva cut off the head of that Vasudeva, and taking it with him, withdrew into his aerial car Sobha, which stood near him in the air. Bhagavan Sri Krishna is the embodiment of perfect wisdom by nature, and has limitless power. Due to affection for his father, he remained plunged in sorrow like an ordinary human being for a moment. But presently he understood that it was nothing but an illusion created by Shalva, who was taught this art by the asura named Maya. As he fully recovered from the spell of Maya, Sri Krishna found that both the messenger and the body of his father had vanished from the battlefield, like visions seen in a dream. Observing Shalva at this moment in his flying aerial car, the Lord resolved to kill him. Parikshit. This is the version of a few rishis who do not care so much for consistency. Surely they forget that such statements with reference to Bhagavan Sri Krishna contradict their own statements made on other occasions. Grief, infatuation, attachment, and fear, these find place only in the ignorant. They cannot be attributed to Bhagavan Sri Krishna, the perfect being, the embodiment of perfect knowledge, wisdom, and glory. The greatest of sages worship the lotus-like feet of Bhagavan Sri Krishna and thereby attain the knowledge of the self, which roots out ignorance existing from time without beginning in the form of identification of the self with the body, and gain infinite spiritual glory. How can the Lord, who is the sole refuge of such sages, be subject to delusion? Here, Shuka is saying the version of a few rishis. He is diplomatically criticizing his own father, who is the one who that version came from. Shalva vigorously attacked Sri Krishna with a volley of weapons, but Sri Krishna, possessed of unfailing prowess, pierced Shalva with a shower of arrows and broke into pieces his armor, bow, and the jewel on his head. With the mace, the Lord smashed Shalva's aerial car, Sobha. Struck by the powerful blow of Sri Krishna's mace, the car broke into 1,000 pieces and fell into the ocean. Leaving the car, Shalva dropped down on land and, taking up his mace, rushed headlong at Sri Krishna. When the Lord saw him advancing towards him, he cut off with a spear the arm with which he held the mace. Then, with a view to killing Shalva, the Lord took up his wonderful chakram, dazzling like the sun at the time of universal destruction. Holding the chakram in his hand, Sri Krishna vied in splendor with the eastern hill bearing the sun on its peak as the sun rises above it. With that chakram, Sri Krishna lopped off the head, adorned with crown and earrings, of that repository of Maya, Shalva. Even as in the days of yore, Indra with his thunderbolt cut off the head of Vritrasura. The fall of Shalva in battle raised an outcry of distress among his men. Parikshit, the gods sounded their drums in heaven when the wicked Shalva was struck down and his aerial car was smashed to pieces. Now came the turn of Dantavaktra, another friend of Shishupala, who marched in great rage against Sri Krishna to avenge the death of his friends, Shishupala and Shalva. Thus ends the 77th discourse entitled The Deliverance of Shalva, in the latter half of Book 10 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. Discourse 78, Deliverance of Dantavaktra and Vidurata and Sutta killed by Sri Balarama during his pilgrimage. Sri Shuka began again. Dantavaktra was a great friend of Shishupala, Shalva, and Paundraka, who had all now met their death at the hands of Bhagavan Sri Krishna. Also, importantly, when we had the story toward the beginning of the whole Bhagavatam of the two Dwarapalas, the door wardens of Vaikuntha Loka, Jaya and Vijaya, who were cursed to incarnate thrice as enemies of their Lord Vishnu. The third were Shishupala and Dantavaktra. So Dantavaktra is the last one. They've already the other one has already gone through his 3 births, and this is the second one's 3rd birth. In order to avenge the death of his friends, the fool appeared all alone to fight Sri Krishna. Full of rage, he neither took an army nor even a chariot with him, and came armed with nothing but a mace. But he was so powerful that the earth shook under his feet when he proceeded on foot to meet Sri Krishna in battle. Seeing him advance in that manner, Bhagavan Sri Krishna promptly took up his own mace, and leaping down from his chariot, intercepted Dantavaktra even as the shore checks the advancing sea. Raising his mace, Dantavaktra, the arrogant Raja of Karusha, said to Bhagavan Sri Krishna, "I am glad, I am indeed lucky, O Krishna, that you have appeared before my eyes today. Even though you are my cousin, you have killed my friends and seek my life too. Therefore, O fool, I shall make short work of you with this mace, which is as hard as the thunderbolt." You'll often hear hard as the thunderbolt in these translations. It's because the word Vajra, which means thunderbolt, also means diamond. So I suspect that would be more accurately rendered hard as diamond. Though a relation of mine, you are my enemy like a disease in one's body. Devoted as I am to my friends, I can discharge my debts to them only by putting an end to you. Parikshit, thus pricking Bhagavan Sri Krishna with unkind words, even as a tamer pricks an elephant with his goad, Dantavaktra struck Sri Krishna on the head with his mace and roared like a lion. But Sri Krishna, the ornament of Yadu's race, remained quite unshaken by the shock, and with his own heavy mace, known by the name of Kaumodaki, struck in his turn a severe blow on Dantavaktra's chest, which split the latter's heart. Vomiting blood through the mouth, Dantavaktra fell down dead on the ground with disheveled hair and outstretched arms and legs. Parikshit, just as it happened when Shishupala fell, a very subtle ray of light emanated from the body of Dantavaktra and entered the body of Sri Krishna in an astonishing way before the eyes of all. Dantavaktra had a brother, Vidurata by name. Overwhelmed with grief at the death of his brother, he appeared, panting with rage on the spot, with a sword and shield in his hands, intent on killing Sri Krishna. Parikshit, as he rushed at him, Sri Krishna, with his sharp-edged discus, lopped off Vidurata's head, armed with a crown and earrings. Thus putting an end to Shalva with his famous aerial car Saubha, as well as Dantavaktra and his younger brother Vidurata, who could not be easily encountered by others, Bhagavan Sri Krishna returned in triumph to Dwaraka. Men and gods extolled him at the time for his extraordinary feat of arms. Sages, Siddhas, Gandharvas, Vidyadharas, great serpents like Vasuki, Apsaras, the Pitris, Yakshas, Kinnaras, and Charanas all showered flowers on him and sang of his victory. The city was decorated to commemorate his triumph over his enemies, and principal Yadava warriors followed him in procession as he entered the city. Parikshit, the master of yoga and almighty ruler of the universe, Sri Krishna, thus enacts various leelas in the world. To the ignorant, he appeared now and then as the vanquished, but as a matter of fact, he always wins. Sri Balarama presently heard of the preparations of the Kurus for war with the Pandavas. He desired to remain neutral, and therefore left Dwaraka on the pretext of going out for a dip in sacred waters. So the reason for this is because hearing of preparations of the Kurus for war means that they're sending messengers around the land, trying to recruit allies and engaging in diplomacy with people, trying to win people over to fight on the Kaurava side instead of on the Pandava side, when the Pandavas are likewise raising troops. And Balarama is good friends with Duryodhana. He was Duryodhana's guru in mace combat and so on. He knows that very soon messengers will come to Dwaraka asking for his assistance and calling on old ties of friendship and so on. And so because he wants to remain neutral, he wants to be unreachable by those messengers. So that's why he is declaring that he's going on a long pilgrimage right now. He first went to Prabhasa, took a plunge in the sea there, and propitiated the gods, rishis, and pitris by offering them water, and propitiated human beings by feeding them. Thus, accompanied by some brahmanas, he proceeded along the bank of the Sarasvati River in an upward journey, in other words, upstream, in the course of which he visited Pratudaka, Bindusara, Tritakupa, Sudarshana, Vishala, Brahmatirtha, Chakratirtha, and the spot where the Sarasvati turns towards the east. Thereafter, passing through the important places on the Jamuna and the Ganga rivers, he came to Naimisharanya, where the sages were holding a religious concourse. They had taken a vow of prolonged satsanga. When they saw Sri Balarama in their midst, the sages rose from their seats, welcomed him, bowed to him or blessed him, according as it became their position, and worshipped him. Honored thus, so in other words, bowed to him or blessed him according as it became their position, meaning the junior sages would bow to Sri Balarama, and the elder sages would offer their blessing, depending on whether they were older or younger than him. Honored thus, when he had taken his seat along with his followers, Sri Balarama observed Roma Harshana, the disciple of the great sage Vyasa, seated on the elevated seat meant for one who holds a discourse. Though a Sutta by caste, he occupied a seat higher than the Brahmanas, and neither rose from his seat nor bowed to Balarama with joined palms. Getting angry at the sight, Sri Balarama said to the Brahmanas there, "How has this Sutta, born as he is of an illegal union, of a Kshatriya father and a Brahmana mother, taken into his head to occupy a seat higher than the Brahmanas and custodians of law like ourselves, the Kshatriyas? The fool therefore deserves to be done to death. Being a disciple of the great sage Vyasa, under whom he has studied all the books of law, including the Itihasas and Puranas, he cannot plead ignorance either. Uncultured and arrogant, he falsely pretends to be a learned man. Since he has not been able to discipline himself, the instruction he has received is just like the part played by an actor on the stage. It can do no good to him nor to anybody else. Those who make a show of righteousness, though not actually righteous, are more sinful than the unrighteous and deserve death at my hands. It is precisely for killing such people that I have descended on earth." Being on a pilgrimage, Sri Balarama had desisted even from the work of slaying the unrighteous in battle. Yet with these words, he struck the Sutta with the end of a blade of kusha grass, which he held in his hand, which caused the instantaneous death of the Sutta. This was how it was destined to be. Nobody could avert it. All the sages cried out in distress when they saw the Sutta fall before them. Addressing Sri Balarama, who was another manifestation of the supreme deity, they said, "O Lord, you have committed an unrighteous act. It was we who offered him the elevated seat of a Brahmana, and vouchsafed him an unwearied existence for the time this assembly remained in session. Thus you have unknowingly perpetrated an act which is equivalent to killing a Brahmana. We know you are a master of yoga and transcend the authority of the Vedas, but you have descended on earth in order to purify the world. Should you of your own accord make some expiation for the sin of killing a Brahmana, you will thereby set a noble example before the world." Bhagavan Sri Balarama said, "I shall certainly make some atonement for this sin in order to teach a lesson to the world. Please lay down the best form of expiation for me. Through Yoga Maya, I can also vouchsafe to him a renewed span of long life." In other words, resurrect him from the dead and give him a renewed span of long life, energy, and soundness of body and the senses, and whatever else you desire. Tell me, what can I do for him? The sages said, "Kindly devise some means by which the infallibility of your weapon and your prowess, and the inevitability of his death, may not be compromised, and the boon granted by us may also be vindicated." Bhagavan Sri Balarama said, "Worshipful sages, the Vedas declare that one's own self is reborn as the sun. Therefore, in place of Roma Harshana, his son will expound the Puranas to you. I shall endow him with long life, energy, and soundness of the body and the senses. If you desire anything else, pray tell me, I shall forthwith grant it. And please think over and tell me what will be the most appropriate expiation for the sin I have unknowingly committed." The sages said, "There was a terrible demon, Balvala by name, son of Ilvala, who comes here on every full moon and new moon day and outrages the sanctity of our gathering. He throws on us piths, blood, feces, urine, wine, and flesh. O Lord of the Adus, be pleased to put an end to that monster. You will have thereby rendered the most valuable service to us. Then, for 12 months, please traverse the whole length and breadth of Bharatavarsha with a serene mind and take a plunge in its holy waters. That will bring you purification from this sin." Thus ends the 78th discourse entitled A Prelude to the Destruction of Balvala, forming part of the narrative of Baladeva and the latter half of Book 10 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. Discourse 79, an account of Balarama's pilgrimage. Sri Shuka began again. "Parikshit, on the next full moon day, a violent storm broke over the place, covering all with dust and bringing the foul odor of pus from all sides. Next, there was a shower of urine and feces on the sacrificial ground, caused by Balvala, who himself appeared afterwards with a trident in his hand. Possessed of a dark, gigantic body, he looked like a heap of soot. His hair, mustaches, and beard had the color of red-hot copper, and his face with protruding teeth and contracted eyebrows looked most terrible. Seeing the demon, Balarama thought of his celebrated pestle which shatters the columns of the enemy's army, and his well-known plow, which subdues the demons. And both these weapons instantaneously presented themselves before him. At the end of it, even though he had not brought them with him on his pilgrimage. With the end of his plow, Balarama drew down Balvala, who was coursing in the air, and full of rage struck that sworn enemy of the Brahmanas on the head with his pestle. With his forehead split open, the demon, bleeding profusely, fell on the ground, uttering a helpless cry, and looked like a mountain peak struck down with lightning and ejecting red streams. The blessed sages of Naimisharanya applauded Balarama, pronounced their unfailing benedictions on him, and sprinkled waters over his head, even as the gods sprinkled water over their ruler Indra on his having killed the demon Vrutra. They presented Balarama with a pair of excellent pieces of cloth and ornaments, and a beautiful Vaijayanti garland, a victory garland, of never-fading lotuses. Now, with the permission of the sages of Naimisharanya, Balarama, together with his Brahmana companions, went to the Kaushiki river, and after bathing in that river, went to the lake from which the Sarayu river emanates. Following the downward course of the Sarayu, he thence came to Prayaga. After taking his bath there and propitiating the gods, rishis, and pitris by offering water to them, he went to the hermitage of the sage Pulaha. He bathed in the Gomati, Gandaki, Vipasha, and Sona rivers, and visiting Gaya, worshipped the pitris according to the instructions of his father, Sri Vasudeva. From Gaya, he went to the mouth of the Ganga, where he took a bath and performed other religious rites. He went to the Mahendra hill, where he saw and paid his respects to the sage Parashurama. Having bathed in the 7 branches of the Godavari river and in the Vena and Bhimarati rivers, as well as in the Pampa lake, he paid a visit to the shrine of Lord Kartikeya, and thence proceeded to Sri Shaila, the abode of Lord Shiva, known by the name of Mallikarjuna. From Sri Shaila, he went to see the most holy mountain peak of Venkata in the Dravida territory. Then, passing through Shivakanchi and Vishnukanchi, and after taking a bath in the holy Kaveri river, he reached the most sacred site of Sri Ranga, where Bhagavan Vishnu eternally dwells. From there, he went to visit the Rishabha hill, sacred to Lord Vishnu, and southern Mathura. So there's Uttara Mathura and Dakshina Mathura, northern Mathura and southern Mathura. So he visited the southern Mathura, and then proceeded to the dam across the sea at Rameshvara, visitors to which are purged even of their greatest sins. There, Balarama gifted 10,000 cows to the Brahmanas. Then, after taking a bath in the Kritamala and Tamraparni rivers, he went to the Malaya mountain. It is one of the 7 principal ranges of mountains of Bharatavarsha. Greeting and bowing to the sage Agastya residing there, and receiving his blessings and permission, he went to the southern sea and visited the shrine of goddess Durga, known by the name of Kanya at Kanyakumari. Next, he went to the Palguna Tirtha called Anantashayana, and the great lake of Panchapsarasa, another abode of Lord Vishnu. There, after bathing in its holy waters, he gave away 10,000 cows to the Brahmanas. Then Lord Balarama visited the principalities of Kerala and Trigarta, and from there he went to Gokarna, sacred to Shiva, where Bhagavan Shankara is eternally present. Thence he visited the shrine of goddess Parvati, known by the name of Arya, located on an island, after when she went to Shurparaka. Then, after bathing in the Tapti, Payoshni, and Nirvindhya rivers, he entered the Dandaka forest. From there, he went to the bank of the Narmada, where stands the city of Mahishmati, and after bathing in the Manutirtha, returned to Prabhasa. There he heard from the mouth of Brahmanas that in the historic fight between the Kurus and the Pandavas, almost all the Kshatriyas had lost their lives. He felt that the burden of the earth had been greatly relieved by that terrible war. On the day Bhima and Duryodhana were engaged in a single combat with their maces on the battlefield, Sri Balarama reached Kurukshetra to prevent their fight. Yudhishthira, for his part, Nakula Sahadeva, Bhagavan Sri Krishna and Arjuna all bowed to him, to Balarama, as soon as they saw him, and stood silent, anxious to know the mission which had brought him there. Bhima and Duryodhana, burning with rage, were then performing, mace in hand, their wonderful maneuvers with a view to overthrowing one another. Seeing them thus engaged, Balarama said, Raja Duryodhana and Bhimasena, both of you are warriors equally matched in strength. If Bhimasena is superior in raw physical strength, Duryodhana is more skillful in wielding the mace. To my mind, neither of you is likely to win or be vanquished, since you possess equal energy. Therefore, let this useless fight cease. Though this advice of Sri Balarama was salutary to both, the enmity which they bore to each other was so deep-seated that they could not accept it. They could not forget the offensive words and malevolent acts of each other. Balarama thought they were being driven to their fate by destiny. Therefore, without making further attempt at compromise or any sort of peacemaking, he returned to Dwaraka. There he was welcomed by Ugrasena and other relations who were all delighted at his arrival. Sri Balarama went to the Naimisha forest for a second time. There the sages, acting as priests, gladly assisted Sri Balarama, who had kept himself aloof from all the hostility and the war, in performing all the sacrifices. Parikshit, all sacrifices are but part and parcel of Sri Balarama, and yet he performed them in order to teach a lesson to the world. The Almighty Balarama imparted pure wisdom to the sages, by virtue of which they realized the whole universe in themselves, and the self as permeating the whole universe. Then, performing the concluding ablutions with his consort Revati, and adorned with fine clothes and beautiful ornaments, he looked, amidst friends and relations, just like the moon accompanied by moonlight. Parikshit, Almighty Bhagavan Sri Balarama is the infinite Lord himself. His nature is incomprehensible. He had assumed a human semblance simply out of sport. His exploits are indeed innumerable. He who contemplates on the wonderful deeds of the infinite, all-pervading Balarama both morning and evening, becomes the most beloved of God. Thus ends the 79th discourse, entitled An Account of the Pilgrimage of Baladeva, in the latter half of Book 10 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. Discourse 80, Sri Krishna's reception of Sudama. Raja Parikshit submitted. O revered sage, Bhagavan Sri Krishna is the same as the Supreme Spirit. His powers are infinite. Therefore, his leelas, which manifest his love and glory, are also infinite. We wish to hear now of the other glorious leelas of the Lord. O sage, all beings on earth running after the mirage of worldly enjoyments are sorely afflicted at heart. The manifold desires pierce them every now and then like the shaft. Under the circumstance, what man of taste is there on earth who, having heard of the excellent leelas of the most glorious Lord, even repeatedly, would cease listening to them further? That speech alone is worth the name of speech, through which one sings his praises. Those hands alone which do service to him deserve to be called hands. That mind alone is rightly so called, which constantly remembers the Lord, dwelling in all mobile and immobile creatures. And those ears alone deserve the title which hear the sacred stories of his leelas. That head alone deserves to be styled as such, which bows to all mobile and immobile creatures, regarding them as the very images of God. That eye alone is the real eye, which sees God in everything. And those limbs alone are properly so called, which are daily sprinkled with the waters, which wash the feet of the Lord and of his devotees. Sri Sutta resumed, O sages, when King Parikshit made this submission to Sri Shuka, the latter's heart got completely merged in the thought of Bhagavan Sri Krishna. Then, addressing the Raja, he said, there was a certain Brahmana who was a friend of Bhagavan Sri Krishna. He possessed true knowledge of Brahman and was free from attachment to the objects of the senses. His mind was composed and he had full control over his senses. Although a householder, he used to remain contented with whatever he got without effort. He was always ill-clad, and his wife, too, had no sufficient clothing to cover her body with. Due to extreme poverty, they seldom had a full meal, and the wife especially became very feeble on account of starvation. One day, the poor and afflicted wife of the Brahmana, who was devoted to her husband, approached her husband with a withering face and a trembling body and said to him, "Adorable husband, Bhagavan Sri Krishna, the spouse of the goddess of wealth, himself is your friend. He is like a wish-yielding tree to his devotees, the refuge of all and a great devotee of the Brahmanas. O Blessed One, be pleased to approach him who is the resort of the righteous. When he comes to know that you are a householder and that you are suffering from want, he will bestow abundant wealth on you. He now resides at Dwaraka as the protector of the Bhojas, Vrishnis, and Andhakas. He is so generous that he gives away his own self to those who contemplate on his lotus feet. It is no wonder then that he, the supreme Jagat Guru, the teacher of the world, should bestow on his devotees wealth and objects of worldly enjoyment, which are after all not very desirable things." Thus frequently and gently entreated by the wife, the Brahmana at last agreed to the proposal, for he thought that it would give him an opportunity of seeing Bhagavan Sri Krishna, which was his supreme gain in itself. Developing this idea in his mind, he decided to go, and addressing his wife said, "Oh dear, is there anything in the house fit to be taken as a present? If so, let me have it." The wife of the Brahmana begged of her neighbors and secured 4 handfuls of parched and beaten rice, which she tied up in a piece of rag, and gave it to her lord for presentation to Sri Krishna. With those handfuls of beaten rice, it is said, the foremost of Brahmana set out on his journey to Dwaraka. His only thought on the way was how it would be possible for him to obtain a sight of Bhagavan Sri Krishna. So the way that they know each other, Sudama and Krishna, is that when Krishna and Balarama, after leaving their childhood home in Vraja, apprenticed themselves for some months to Maharishi Sandipani and lived at his ashram. Sudama was another one of the disciples of Maharishi Sandipani. He lives in Ujjain, which is a very long journey on foot from Dwaraka. Reaching Dwaraka, the Brahmana, together with other Brahmanas, passed through 3 camps of guards and 3 protective walls, one after another, and then reached the mansions occupied by the Andhaka and Vrishni chiefs, who followed the righteous ways of the devotees of God, very difficult of access to ordinary people. There was situated in the center of the innermost ring of the city, the palace of Bhagavan Sri Krishna, containing the dwellings of his 16,000 and odd consorts. In one of them, which was specially decorated, the Brahmana entered with the feelings of one who found himself merged in the bliss of God realization. Bhagavan Sri Krishna was at that time seated on a couch with his consort Rukmini. Seeing the Brahmana from a distance, he suddenly rose from his seat and, advancing towards him, joyously folded him in both of his arms. The lotus-eyed Lord, who is the very embodiment of bliss, felt extremely delighted when he touched the body of his beloved friend, the Brahmana sage. Tears of joy began to drop from his eyes. Taking the Brahmana by the hand, Sri Krishna, the purifier of the world, made his friend sit on his own couch, and bringing himself all the articles necessary for worship, washed the Brahmana's feet and sprinkled his head with the drops of that water. Then he smeared the Brahmana's body with excellent perfumes, as well as with the pastes of sandal, aloe wood, and saffron. Having joyfully worshipped his friend with scented fumes and rows of lights, and offered him betel leaf seasoned with catechu, lime, areca nut, parings, and cloves, etc., and a cow, the Lord greeted the Brahmana with sweet words. The Brahmana was ill-clad, with an unclean and emaciated body, the veins of which were visible to the eyes. Queen Rukmini herself actually waited on him, having the chowry before him. The women of the palace were astonished to see a naked Brahmana being so lovingly honored by Bhagavan Sri Krishna of spotless fame. They said to one another, "What meritorious act was performed by this naked, destitute, condemned and lowly beggar, that the Lord of the 3 worlds, Bhagavan Sri Krishna, should receive him with such honor and respect?" Leaving Sri Rukmini, a manifestation of goddess Lakshmi herself, who was seated with him in his bed, he embraced the Brahmana as if he were Lord Balarama himself. Parikshit, taking each other by the hand, Bhagavan Sri Krishna and the Brahmana recounted the sweet incidents of their boyhood when they lived together in the house of the same teacher. Bhagavan Sri Krishna said, "O pious Brahmana, on your return from the Guru's house after making the voluntary present to him, did you or did you not marry a wife who was in every respect worthy of you?" I know that even though you are leading the life of a householder, your heart is free from worldly desires. I am also aware that having realized the truth, you do not entertain any love for wealth. People who have shaken off worldly desires brought forth by divine Maya, and who yet perform their prescribed duties with a heart unswayed by desire, just as I do, for the sake of setting an example before the world, are very rare. Do you remember, O dear Brahmana, our stay in the house of our Guru? It is there that the Dvijas acquire the knowledge of that which is worth knowing, and thus cross the darkness of ignorance in the form of mundane existence. O friend, the father from whom one gets the body is the first Guru in this world. Next comes the teacher, who invests one with the sacred thread and teaches him his obligatory duties. He is worthy of adoration like myself. Lastly comes the teacher who imparts the knowledge of self to men of all classes and orders and helps one in the realization of God. He is identical with me. O dear friend, the teacher is the same as myself. Among the followers of the Varnashrama order in this world, they alone who carry out the Guru's teachings and thereby cross the ocean of mundane existence without much ado, know their true worldly and otherworldly interests. O friend, I am the universal self. I reside in every heart as the witness. I am not so pleased with the performance of daily obligatory sacrifices by the householder, nor with investiture with the sacred thread and study of the scriptures, which is the duty of a celibate, nor with the penance of the ascetic, nor again with the quietism of the recluse, as I am with services rendered by a shishya to the Guru. O dear Brahmana, do you remember the incident how one day, when living in the house of our Guru, we were both asked by the latter's wife to bring fuel? We entered a thick forest, O sage, and were overtaken by a mighty and violent storm of wind and rain, which broke unexpectedly out of season, and thunders roared relentlessly over our head. The sun set in the meanwhile, and all sides were enveloped in darkness. The land being covered with water, we could not ascertain the high and low level of ground. Severely and repeatedly beaten by violent blasts of wind and showers in that flood, and not knowing the directions, we wandered in the forest in great confusion, holding each other by the hand. Our Guru, sage Sandipani, when he learnt this, proceeded in search of us at sunrise and discovered us, his disciples, in that bewildered state. He said, "My dear boys, you have been put to great hardship on my account. One's own self is dear to all more than anything else. How wonderful that you have shown your devotion to me by disregarding even the self. A good disciple should offer with a sincere heart his all, including his very self, to the Guru. That is precisely what he should actually do in order to repay the debt to the Guru. O jewels of the twice-born, I am supremely pleased with you. Let all your desires be fulfilled, and may all the knowledge of the Vedas that you have acquired from me remain ever fresh in your memory. May it never fail you, whether here or hereafter." O friend, numerous incidents of this type occurred during our life at the Guru's house. It is by the grace of the Guru alone that man attains perfection and supreme peace. The Brahmana replied, "O God of gods, Guru of the world, what else remains to be achieved by me? I have accomplished everything, realized everything, inasmuch as I enjoyed the privilege of staying in the Guru's house with you, whose resolution is unfailing. O Lord, the Vedas, which are the repository of the four objects of life, dharma, artha, kama, and moksha, constitute your body. You went to the Guru's house to study those very Vedas, only to imitate the ways of men as a matter of sport." Thus ends the 80th discourse, forming part of the story of Sudama, and the latter half of Book 10 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. Discourse 81, the story of parched rice, brought as a present by Sudama. Sri Shuka began again. Bhagavan Sri Krishna knows the mind of all beings. He is devoted to Brahmanas and is the sole refuge of saints. Thus heartily talking along with that honorable Brahmana, he now smilingly spoke to his dear comrade in a jesting mood, looking at him with eyes full of affection. The glorious Lord said, "O friend, what present have you brought for me from your house? I consider as great even a small present offered by the devotee with real love. But a lot of things offered without devotion do not bring me pleasure. Whosoever offers to me with love a leaf, a flower, a fruit, or even water, I accept and heartily enjoy that offering of love by that man of purified intellect." Parikshit, though encouraged by the Lord in this way, the Brahmana, feeling shy, did not present the handful of beaten rice to the Lord of Lakshmi himself. He hung his head. But the Lord, who sees the mind of all beings, knew the cause of his visit. He said to himself, This Brahmana is a great friend of mine. He never sought wealth from me before. He approached me now at the entreaty of his devoted wife, whom he is naturally anxious to please. I shall bestow on him a fortune which is difficult of attainment even by the immortals." Reflecting thus, the Lord snatched from under the covering of the Brahmana the beaten rice tied in a bag and said, "Dear comrade, what is this? Here you have brought me something which I like most. These grains of beaten rice will satisfy not only me, but the whole world." Saying this, Bhagavan Sri Krishna ate one handful of that beaten rice and took a second to eat, when Rukmini, who was a manifestation of the goddess of wealth herself, caught hold of the Lord's hand. For devoted as she was to the Lord himself, she was unable to leave him. She said, "O Lord of the universe, this is enough. One handful of rice is sufficient to please you and to bring an abundance of wealth of all kinds in this as well as the next world." That Brahmana spent the night in Bhagavan Sri Krishna's palace, partook of a hearty repast, and felt himself as happy as if he were in the Lord's own paradise. The next morning, taking leave of Bhagavan Sri Krishna, he left for his home. The source of life, of the entire universe, the very embodiment of self-enjoyment, Bhagavan Sri Krishna followed him to some distance, delighted him by sweet and polite words, and bowed to him. Even though the Brahmana did not receive any fortune from the Lord directly, he did not ask for anything himself. He felt ashamed of the meanness of his heart that he even had the thought of, "Oh, he didn't give me anything." He, however, felt supremely happy for having obtained the blessed darshana of Bhagavan Sri Krishna. He said to himself, "O wonder of wonders, I have seen today with my own eyes Bhagavan Sri Krishna's love for a Brahmana. He is really a devotee of the Brahmanas. He clasped to his bosom, which is the abode of the goddess of wealth, a destitute like myself. What affinity is there between me, a vile sinner and destitute, and Sri Krishna, the abode of Lakshmi? Only because I am born of Brahmana parents, he folded me in his arms. Not only that, like his own brother, he made me sit on the bed of his beloved consort Rukmini, and finding me fatigued, Queen Rukmini fanned me with a chowri in her hand. The god of gods who treats the Brahmana as his deity shampooed my feet and rendered every other form of personal service to me and treated me with the respect due to a god. Heavenly bliss, salvation, riches of this world or of the netherworld, and all supernatural powers follow from the worship of his feet. And yet he did not give me even a little wealth, because he thought, poor as I was, wealth would completely turn my head and make me forget him. Oh, how merciful is the Lord to me. He has really done me an act of grace by withholding wealth from me." Musing inwardly thus, the Brahmana arrived near his house. There he found the area surrounded on all sides by 7-storied buildings, resplendent as the sun, fire, and the moon. It was interspersed with beautiful gardens and parks, which resounded with the warbling of birds of all descriptions, with ponds and pools in which various types of lilies and lotuses were in full blossom. Well-adorned men and pretty women were moving here and there. The Brahmana stood puzzled at the sight. He said to himself, "What is this I am seeing? Whose place is this? Is this the same place where I lived? What magic has transformed it into so many palaces?" As he was engrossed in these thoughts, men and women possessing the splendor of gods advanced to receive the blessed Brahmana, singing and playing upon various musical instruments. Hearing of the return of her lord, the wife of the Brahmana was extremely delighted at heart, and in joyous impatience hurriedly came out of the palace. She looked like the veritable goddess Lakshmi coming out of her abode. At the sight of her husband, her eyes became wet with tears of love and excitement. Closing her eyes out of shyness, she respectfully bowed to him and mentally embraced him. The Brahmana was astonished to see his wife brilliant like a celestial lady and shining in the midst of maidservants adorned with necklaces of gold. Followed by her, he now joyfully entered his own house, which contained hundreds of columns of gems and looked like the abode of the celestial king Indra. It was furnished with bedsteads made of ivory and plated with gold, the beds on which were spread sheets as white and soft as the foam of milk. Chowries with gold handles were hanging here and there. There were seats of gold provided with soft cushions, and strings of pearls hung from brilliant canopies. The walls, made of clear crystal, were inlaid with emeralds, and excellent images of women made of precious stones held dazzling jewels in their hands to light up the rooms. Seeing there such abundance of riches of all kinds come to him without any ostensible cause, the Brahmana reflected on this windfall with a calm mind. "I am poor and unlucky from birth. Wherefore could this wonderful fortune come to me? Nothing but the gracious look of Bhagavan Sri Krishna, the crown jewel of Yadus and the possessor of untold riches, could be the cause of this. Sri Krishna, the Lord of the goddess of wealth, perfect in every way, has infinite objects of enjoyment always at his disposal. Therefore, knowing the mind of his suppliant devotee, he gives in abundance to the latter, though he regards the gift as very insignificant and does not even mention it to the devotee. My friend, the crest jewel of Yadus, is generous like the cloud, which, though capable of filling up the ocean, sometimes does not choose to rain in the presence of the peasant, but inundates his fields at night when he is asleep. Though underrating his own abundant gifts, he makes much even of a small present by his devotee. The noble-minded Lord accepted with great delight the handfuls of beaten rice I took for him. May I secure from birth to birth his goodwill, love, friendship, and service. I have no need for wealth. May I cherish ever-growing devotion to the lotus feet of the glorious Lord Bhagavan Sri Krishna, the one abode of excellent qualities, and obtain association with his devotees. Bhagavan Sri Krishna, who is ever free from the shackles of birth and death, is acquainted with the evil underlying worldly prosperity. He knows how the intoxication of wealth and power brings about the fall of many a wealthy man. That is why, out of compassion, he very often refuses to grant the prayer for wealth, kingdom, and power of short-sighted devotees. Having reached this conclusion by force of his reason, the Brahmana, in conjunction with his wife, enjoyed the worldly pleasures sparingly and without attachment, and his devotion to Sri Krishna grew from more to more. The Almighty God of gods, the Lord of sacrifices, Bhagavan Sri Krishna, looks upon the Brahmana as his own Lord and deity. Therefore, there is no being on earth greater than the Brahmana. Now, this Brahmana, the friend of the Lord, realized that, though unconquerable by others, the Lord easily submits to the will of his devotee. Realizing this, he became absorbed in contemplation on the Lord. His ties of ignorance were cut asunder by force of this contemplation, and before long he attained the abode of the Lord, the sole resort of saints. The man who hears this account, which illustrates Bhagavan Sri Krishna's love for the Brahmanas, attains devotion to the Lord and obtains release from the bondage of karma. Thus ends the 81st discourse entitled The Story of the Beaten Rice, and the latter half of Book 10 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. And I think that might be a good stopping point. It's almost 10 o'clock. And that's kind of that's the end of Sudama's story, and that's kind of the end of a cycle of stories, and the next discourse starts in and with a different subject. So I think that's probably a good break.
Awesome. Thank you, Devala.
Yeah, thank you guys for coming. Yeah. I have a minute. You can ask questions.
I'll unmute. I thought I had heard that Sudama took another birth after this in a Shura form. Is there something like that? I was surprised.
There is not in the Bhagavatam, at least. It's possible that there is in. I don't think this story. It's not in the Mahabharata. It might be in the Harivansha, or in some of the other Puranas that deal with the life of Krishna. Those would be either in the Padma Purana, the Brahma Vaivarata Purana, or the Vishnu Purana. I don't think it's in the Vishnu Purana though. Possibly, but definitely not in the Bhagavatam version, at least.
Yeah, I like it better when it has that completion there. It's such a beautiful story.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I mean, that would be compatible with what it said here. It said that he soon attained to the Lord's divine abode, soon attained Salokya Moksha, but it didn't explicitly say that it was soon as in that same birth. It may not have, yeah, but yeah.
Huh.
I had a question, Devala, if I may.
Sure.
First of all, what did happen to Vasudeva when
in the battle with Shalva? Nothing. The whole thing was an illusion. Vasudeva was he wasn't fighting because he was quite elderly at the time, long since retired from war, and he was just safe in the city. The whole thing was an illusion that Shalva made.
Wow. Right. And so and then let's see, it's on verse 39 of one of those books. So there was a reference to a Bharatavarsa.
Bharatavarsha, yeah.
Well,
So
I lost my page on that, but
yeah, sure. So I can explain what Bharatavarsha is. So literally,
context too.
what Bharatavarsha means is the land of Bharata. Bharata being one of the ancient Chakravartin emperors who kind of gave his name to the land. So Bharatavarsha has a couple of meanings. The most common and simplest meaning is essentially India. Bharatavarsha is the native name for India. And indeed, it is still what Indians call India. Like similarly to how, like Germans don't call Germany, Germany, they call it Deutschland. Modern Indians call it Bharatavarsha, and they normally shorten it to Bharata or Bharat. But that's still, Bharatavarsha is still the actual name of India. India is a Greek word. It also has the sense in a larger cosmic sense, if we get into sort of the Puranic cosmology that we dealt with in book 5 of the Bhagavatam, that when we talked about Jambudvipa, the big island continent of Jambudvipa with its 9 divisions. Yeah, with its 9 divisions surrounding Mount Meru. Bharatavarsha is the south center division. In that sense, it's much vaster than just the modern land of India. But in the sense of when we're describing Balarama's pilgrimage across the length and breadth of Bharatavarsha, and then it goes into detail about what that means. What it clearly means is the subcontinent of India. It's describing all these rivers that he visited, all these mountains that he visited, and it's clearly just in that sense, Bharatavarsha meant, roughly speaking, the Indian subcontinent.
Cool.
Yeah, it's bigger than the modern country of India. It includes what is today India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Sri Lanka, and up into parts of Tibet and so on. But it's a big region.
Oh yeah, there was that one sentence at the very end. I'm gonna find it. It's I think I'm on it now. It says for 12 months. Oh yeah, please traverse the whole length and breadth of Bharatavarsha with mind and take a plunge in its holy waters.
Yes, and then normally that would be taken to mean the Indian subcontinent, and then it details exactly where he went and confirms. Cool. all of those rivers they're still there. They're still called those names. You can draw that on a map, and it's basically a tour of India.
Nice.
Yeah.
Right on. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you guys for coming. All right.
Have a great week. Hare Krishna.
You too. Hare Krishna.
Thank you, Jai Gurudev.
Jai Gurudev.